You know, she did the last time I talked to her is Rose Martin. Like, do you remember her?
That seems barely.
Yeah, because I guess she was like maybe a senior or freshman or something.
No, but she graduated from that.
Oh, so she was just around.
Yeah, like she was never have that. Should have everybody. I was like, no.
Yeah, okay, yeah. She was just like someone else in the ballroom. She because she studied engineering at Mud, and then she spent some time with parents on a winery in Northern California. And she spent some time there over COVID and that stuff. And she was actually on nursing specifically for palliative care. Which is also cool that that's like what she wanted to do. And then, but I don't remember where she landed. I do know she still dancing. She would do that all these like, yeah, great. Was great.
I've heard.
I wasn't sure if you would think it was just swing at all.
No, I think
Oh,
Oh, yeah. She only was two in house for 2 years. In undergrad.
yeah. Did Grace coach you? Or were you having morning bridge? I was like, I gotta get my village one. So maybe it was after that. So that's so funny. I didn't know. I didn't know. You know, I think Matthew was in DC. Yeah. Not really. I haven't seen him in. I mean, I saw him before. He was by New York. And my friend Steve. Yeah, last I saw him was before COVID because he's still Jack Stone when I last saw him. Yeah, Jack Stone's still up to his. Yeah, I mean, up to his ways. It's yeah.
I think that's the way I actually do
that. Yes.
Everyone.
Take that. Thank you.
We have more people coming down the stairs. Not yet. Right. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Emily Summer. I am the adult book buyer here at East City Bookshop, and I am delighted to see you all here this evening. If it's your first time in the store, an extra special welcome. We're glad you're here. We hope you'll come back. If you are joining us on Zoom, we are very glad that you're joining us that way too. So to our virtual participants, thank you for being here. Especially thank you for coming out on such a hot and humid night. To our in-store friends, because it's steamy out there. So thanks for making it out. Before we get to tonight's conversation, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. I also just finally finished Priya Parker's The Art of Gathering, and one of the things she says is never welcome a gathering with housekeeping notes. So maybe for the next event, I will have revamped my intro. But for tonight, there will be a time for audience questions at the end of the conversation. So please hold your questions until then. We're in a small enough space too that we won't give you the mic. So if you'll just please speak up when you ask your question, and then Stevie will repeat the question into the mic for our friends who are watching at home. If you need a bathroom, we've got that upstairs past the register and the greeting cards. Most importantly, if you still need a copy or copies of Babylon, South Dakota, those are also available upstairs. And we thank you for purchasing your copies. The only reason we're able to host fun events like this is with your support. So if you haven't already bought a copy of the book, we urge you. We hope you'll do so tonight. And now the reason that we are here. It is my immense pleasure to welcome to East City Bookshop Babylon, South Dakota author Tom Lin. Yay! Tom was born in China and immigrated to the United States when he was 4. A graduate of Pomona College, he also holds a PhD from the University of California, Davis. He teaches English and creative writing at the University of Iowa. And his first novel, The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence and is a staff favorite here at East City Bookshop. To see why we are so excited for Tom to be with us, you need only look at the glowing blurbs about this book. The great Ed Park says, "I loved this novel, which was so transporting that I forgot to look at my phone. Lin's gossamer prose is patient and full of wonders." Kaveh Akbar says, "I can't remember the last time I felt so lit up by a novel. Lin has built this wildly ambitious, deeply strange world with its own ecology and physics and sociology that is also, importantly, our world in all times past, present, and future. I love these characters. I love this prose. Babylon, South Dakota is a chilling diorama of what and how and who empire steals from us. If you can believe it, that is not even the entire quote. I cut it slightly short. We will hear more details about the book and Tom's achievement with it while he is in conversation tonight with Stevie Billow. Stevie is a writer and editor living in Washington, D.C. Their work has been supported by Grub Street, Seventh Wave, Shenandoah Literary Magazine, and the Key West Literary Seminar, among others. Most recently, Stevie received research support from the John and Helen Timo Foundation for their writing on Rusyn identity and culture. By day, Stevie is my colleague, a bookseller and dog photographer here at East City Bookshop. Welcome and thank you, Stevie and Tom. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. What'd you write for Grub Street?
Oh, I had a fellowship through them actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, many moons ago.
Well, thank you. I'm always interested in people who get to write about food. Thank you all for being here so much. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And thank you for coming out when it's so hot, it's really grotesque out there. And if I could barely survive it, I'm really glad that you guys willingly braved it to come out here. I will give you my elevator pitch for the book, which if you've read it, you'll find hopelessly lacking. Don't worry, I know. I also think it's hopelessly lacking. I was just talking about it with Stevie, and if they've come up with a good blurb in the meantime, we're also gonna hear it. I've been saying that it is an immigrant family moves from China to South Dakota in the mid 1970s to build a life and on a homestead that they inherit. But also that on that homestead, the U.S. government installs a nuclear missile silo, and then here's where the blurb kind of really gets bad. And then I say strange things happen, and then I go, but you'll really like it. And I think it's a really fun book. But that's all I've got.
Yeah, I mean that sounds rock on. That sounds perfect. That is basically the entire book, and I don't think we need to talk anymore about it. Actually.
Awesome. All right, so we'll take.
So thanks for coming out tonight. But yeah, actually, I mean this book is so rich in just crazy beautiful imagery, and this initial image, I mean, of May and Saul coming to America, starting this chrysanthemum farm, and then the government comes and builds a missile silo on their land. It's just so striking, and I'd love to hear about where did this idea come from and how did it evolve into what is now Babylon.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really, well, I'd like is a strange word to use. I've always been very interested in nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons as well, and I think and so I was so interested in them actually that I decided to do a whole PhD about science fiction and the development of nuclear missiles. And so I was doing all this research. I was going to these rocket silos. I was interviewing these guys with like kind of terrifying posters on their door in Florida, and I was like asking them about their work. And I was driving through South Dakota. I've been there maybe like now 7 or 8 times all the way through, looking at these old missile silos. And I was kind of consistently hitting walls as I was writing my dissertation. And I was like, I'm certainly not going to waste this research by using it only once when it's good for 2 things. So I decided I would write a novel as well because it felt like a way of approaching the same questions that I had was trying to answer with the dissertation. And that was a really smart thing because it gave me 2 things then that I could experience writer's block on instead of just one. And so like I could hit my head on different walls depending on how I was feeling. But it was a combination of all of this kind of knowledge in my brain about nuclear missiles, which I find really comforting. I think it's very like for me, I think I encountered the idea of the end of the world through nuclear Armageddon like once, and I was like, oh, like in order for that not to destroy my life, I need to learn everything that I can about it. And so it brings me a great deal of comfort to know a lot about it. There are people such as my wife who really hate hearing about nuclear missiles at all. But I think like it was this kind of I wanted to express that comfort with the knowledge of what could be our own destruction, and at the same time I wanted to include all these stories from my family that I was beginning to get, and find a way to work them in. And I was also playing around with like we at the time we had just like kind of sat back and realized that my family, we had been in the States for like 25 years, which was totally crazy. And I was like talking with my mom about it, and I was like talking with my grandparents about it. And I had all these stories, which I was like, oh, these are great. Like, this is great material, but I don't want to like just like write somebody else's memoirs. And so I essentially, going back to the brick walls, I just like knocked my head against the brick wall for like 2 years, essentially, or like almost 3 years, until I had something that I think could hold all of them together in the same place, but also make it feel like they all had something to do with one another, which I think is the real challenge.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think all fiction ultimately there is a degree of autofiction
Mhm.
in I mean every novel, every short story that you read, right? And I'm curious, I mean, anything specific that you'd care to share that appears in the book that is inspired by a family story?
Yeah, there is. I'll give you two for the price of one, um, and the price is free. So the first one is that in this book, quite central character is this three-legged dog named Santue. And he's enormous. He's like he's a huge white dog, and he lives for a very very long time, which is not a spoiler. Um, he added desperately. Um, but that dog is based on my the dog that I had growing up, who very sadly we had to put down not too long, about a month ago. But she was a Siberian Husky. She was 85 pounds, which if you know Huskies is monstrous. And she lived until she was 16 years old, which again, if you know Siberian Huskies, is monstrous. And so she was this ancient giant dog. And she was kind of coming to the end of her life. It was getting to the point where like every time I would go back to my parents' house, I would do a kind of very solemn petting of her, where I'd be like, I would say things like, instead of saying like good dog, I would say like you're a good old girl, and like I kind of like prepping myself for it. And so I was like, well, I'll just put her in the book, and that way she can really live forever. But I'll change her name a little bit because her name, the real dog's name is Argo, which in Chinese means second dog. Um, and the punchline, of course, is that we didn't we that was our first dog. Which and of course, my parents thought this was so funny. Um, but I am the first dog.
Oh,
So I was like, well, she's gonna have a different name in the book. And then the second thing that came from a family story is there is a little flashback to this moment when the communist army is kind of is sweeping back over China and liberating the villages they come across, and in a panic, all of the girls and women who are not married in the village get married off because they're afraid that this invading army will come and pillage their stores and take all their women. And then as a result, the town beauty is married off to this family of rock breakers that live in a cave. And believe it or not, that is a story that my grandma told me happened in her village. And I was and when I heard that story, I was like, I have to verify this. I have to read all these books about Chinese history to make sure that I'm not repeating a falsehood. And then I realized like that we don't do that to family stories, right? Like we're not interested in their veracity. We're interested in them because they come to us from another time through someone we love. And they're interesting because they're old. And that actually doesn't matter if your grandpa was there at the World Series when they like it matters that he thinks he was, right? And it's a cool story, and actually like you're absolved of the citational responsibility because it's a family story. And I think that's a story that when I put it into the book, I was like, oh, I actually no longer care if this is true, um, because what's important is that it's here.
it's such a I don't know, the combination of this missile research and the family stories is so I don't know, it's delightful in a way, honestly. And I'm curious, how was the experience of writing this book, your second novel, different than writing your debut, Mingsu, which I don't know if actually you could just tell the audience a little bit about
Oh yeah,
that
yeah,
without so we know
yeah. That one
what
has
it is.
that one has a much better elevator pitch. It's much more high concept, which is a Chinese American assassin is tearing his way across the American West in the late 1800s to rescue his abducted wife, and that was just like flash and filigree and again much easier to summarize. Like that one is much more plot based. Um, but I was just talking about this actually with a friend. Because I was like, writers are in the only industry where like every couple of years like we lay an egg, which is not only like a thing that we've made but also like a ripe psychoanalytical target, and then anyone who wants to like make a lot of assumptions or claims about who we are as people like just has to read our work and then can kind of track the, so I think when I think back to my first book, I was like, oh, that is a book that I wrote like when I was that age, which was like in my early 20s. um and and then I think of this book as being a book that like kind of heralds I've been saying the twilight of my youth, which is my age now. My age now begins with a 3, um, and I think like the for me like it's a very kind of it feels very almost like watching yourself grow up. It's very odd. Like when I read my first book, I think of like I can see edits that I would make now that I wouldn't have made earlier, but it feels like it's this kind of totally bizarre feeling of like walking into like a room and looking at the mirror and seeing yourself 5 years ago. Like it's totally destabilizing. I recognize the person who wrote that book, but it's not me anymore. And so there's a sense in which like your first book is everyone's like, oh my god, like your debut, and like you come down the stairs at the cotillon, and what this is it, and your dress is going out behind you, and you're like, this is my first time I've ever been out, and then your second book is like, oh, him again. Right. But I think like in the second book there's a sense in which like I had to kind of say writing is something that I feel like I have to do whether or not it's fun and whether or not anyone reads it, because if I don't do it I'll explode. Because like in the first book you're like, and you're in the first book you're picturing your debut, and then in the second book it's just something you have to do. And either you manage to do it or you find that you only have one book in you. And I think like that's the nightmare of all writers, is that they only had one book in them. And I don't think like anyone only has one book in them, but I think everyone feels like they might when they're writing the second book.
Oh, well, I'm glad you didn't explode. I'm glad that this book exists. So both of your books, begin with immigrants at, their core. But I feel like Babylon really subverts a lot of expectations that we might have of the, quote unquote immigrant narrative in some really, pointed and profound ways. And I'm curious, how do you feel this book both contributes to and challenges this kind of broader canon of immigrant narratives?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when I think of immigrant narratives and I think it's like I don't think this is something that people do like consciously or even willingly, but I think immigrant narratives has become synonymous with a certain kind of like plot of suffering, right? But specifically of like marginalization and suffering. Like the immigrant narrative is one of total privation in a new land, where the characters constantly are kind of faced with their alienness and their lack of belonging, and like the fact that they are subaltern in this society, right? Like the immigrant narrative, it has this kind of legacy of one, like in my old country I was a neurosurgeon, and now here I deliver pizzas. And I think that like we again, like is a very strange word to use here, but I think we respond to those narratives because they articulate this, like they have a really kind of easy pathos to them, which is like these people they're trying very hard and doing something, and they're suffering a huge amount for no reason, simply because they want to do something different, they want to build a new life. And in this book I was interested in like, I mean, like, and if you read it, like the characters certainly suffer, right? Like they don't have a good time here. Like they certainly have a hard and difficult time here. But I wanted to let them suffer and have it be meaningful for them, like outside of the context of like we're washing plates, or like that we've like moved to a different stratum of society, like socially, right? Like I wanted that suffering to be kind of divorced of the rest of the world. Like this is a book that happens only on their homestead. All of their privations and their suffering and their kind of challenges like come from this intersection of where they are and who they are, but not necessarily anybody else. Which I think is like, I mean, it's still an immigrant narrative, but it's one which no longer is interested in necessarily articulating that kind of um, this. It's almost like a touristic impulse of like wanting to see somebody um really go from, oh, I don't they don't know the language and they're delivering pizzas, and now they've remade themselves in their old image. Like I think that that is a narrative which also answers to a lot of assumptions that we have about like capitalism and hard work and like a meritocracy. And I wanted just an immigrant narrative where it was like people in a new place trying to just get along and get by.
Hmm.
Like the barest bones of that. And then, within that structure to then introduce like, and then also there's a US government, right?
Yeah.
Like that no matter, you can go to the ends of the earth, but um states will find you, like geopolitics will find you. That there is nowhere here which is not connected to anywhere else.
Mm. Gosh, I think one of my favorite parts in this book is when a reporter comes to the house to kind of investigate all of these weird happenings that are going on the homestead, right? Because there's this missile silo and the government is starting to build an identical house to the house where our, protagonists live. And the reporter is interviewing Saul and is kind of asking, but like, oh yeah, but can you tell me about, like your immigrant story and how you've suffered? And Saul's like, they're building a duplicate of my house. My wife can tell the future by looking at birds. Like my kid can talk to animals. And you want me to draw you my family tree? And the reporter's like, yeah, that'd be great, actually. And I just think it was such a wonderful moment of as a reader being called out. I really appreciated that a lot. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. So time and space
Yeah.
are super elastic in this book. And I think normally, chronology kind of provides this scaffolding for a story.
Yeah.
But it's so bendy and it's so twisty in Babylon. I'm just kind of curious, what role do you feel like this kind of fluid time and space play in the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in like I I remember like being a little kid and like trying like going to the library to use a computer there. Again, my age starts with a 3. Going to the library and using a computer there, and then like looking up on the internet like who decided when it was the first Monday, like who like and like if I'd still be curious. I'd still love to know. I'm very interested in like time being this thing that exists only because like we all agree on it. And but if we were all struck on the head at the same time, like as a planet, like we'd have to decide, like, is it still Monday? Like when do we start the clock again? And I became interested in the way that, like, if you ask someone to tell stories from their past, very rarely do they give you a year. uh like they'll say like, oh, when I was younger, and they'll give you the story, and then you go, oh, when was that? And usually they'll say something like, oh, it must have been, right? Which is like, that's not like, like if you were talking to your accountant and you asked them for a fact, and he said like, oh, it must have, like, you'd be like, well, why don't you check that, right? But there's a way that like we think of time as being so rigorous and well defined, and yet like it's really not. It really is not well defined for us in normal life, right? We exist in our own proper time. We find that we have grown older, and it's surprising to us, because we're not, like, like, we're not prisoners, like, scratching the days. Like, that's why it's so uneasy to see like prisoners scratching the days that they've been in prison onto the walls, because like no one should do that. No one should mark time that way. And so I think like time is always elastic, and we kind of like, because we have to do things like go to work and like file taxes and like keep track of when's Monday. Like we think of it as being very rigorous, but there's really no, like, I remember, like, I would remember asking my grandparents like how old they were, and they would have to think about it. And as a kid I was like, how could you not know? Like, I'm 5.5, right? But
Yeah.
like but they'd be like, oh, like, they would say like, I'm just very old.
Hmm.
um and I'm kind of coming around to that now, of like there is no, not that I'm very old. I can still run and jump. I'm very youthful. And I only have sciatica sometimes. But like this idea that like we all experience proper time, right? And sometimes when we love each other, we experience proper time together. We keep track of the days and the passage of the years together as a unit. And then only when we have to, or when we need to, we can link our own proper time. We can coordinate it with everybody else's time. But left to our own devices, just with the people we love, we pass through time at our own speed. Um, and I think a similar thing happens with space. Like there's this artist Richard Serra, and all he does is he like takes these giant pieces of steel, and he like positions them in ways that are totally disconcerting. And so there's one piece that he has where it's like a 5 ton slab of steel, and it hangs above you on the ceiling, and there's a 5 ton slab of steel, and it's below you, and there's nothing between them. Right, that's the point, is that there's nothing between them, but there is that, like, that space between them becomes charged with power, right? Because like that top piece could fall or that bottom piece could sink. And so there are ways to define space that make it elastic or palpable or like bouncy, that doesn't involve putting things in them, but rather putting things around them. And I think that's what happens with space in this book as well. Like, it takes place only on this homestead, but the world around them is what makes that homestead so charged.
Mm-hmm. Gosh. Wow. No, sorry. There's just, I mean, this book does a really interesting thing where you're kind of balancing, this kind of quantum physics, freaky stuff going on with science, along with, this kind of magical realism vibe, as well as, a sense of like folk magic and, like fortuitousness. But juxtaposed with those two things are all these allusions to Christianity. And I'm curious if you could talk about your choice to include those things and kind of how you're balancing that with everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I did promise you this lore.
Yes.
I was raised, I think, like half-heartedly immigrant Christian, and by which I mean, like, my parents, when they arrived in the United States, like, they found community very quickly with like Christian Chinese Americans, which involved going to like a Chinese American Christian church, and which for me involved like going to Sunday school a lot, um, and and like my parents are no longer. I think they would still consider themselves religious, like fearfully. If you reminded them, they'd say like, oh, and yes, and they certainly have the guilt of not having gone to, like, right. So it's worked in that respect, that they feel bad that they haven't gone to church
It's the most important
in
part.
many years. Yeah, like it's still there for them. But for me, it meant that like a lot of my childhood was spent committing vast tracts of scripture to memory for no apparent reason, right? And that I was kind of just like immersed in these stories, and I thought of them as stories, right? And like language, and that I felt had kind of like defined a large part of my life, and I didn't know what to do with. And then, and I'm not religious now, but when I was speaking to all these scientists and doing all this research, especially like when you think about science, right? Like, and when you like really think about it, like sit in a chair and stare at the wall and like think about science and think about religion. Like, the thing that occurred to me was that these are two, like, they both have uh stories for what will happen, beyond what we know, right? Like, they're competing epistemologies of what makes knowledge, like what happens after you die. Like, we have one answer which comes from religion, we have another answer which comes from science, um and the distinction between those, like not necessarily faith in the religious sense, but the distinction between what to believe happens to us when we don't know, and when we can never know, is a thing of faith. And for me, faith is magic, right? Faith is knowing that something is true even if you can never know. And I think, like, the way that I thought of, especially like kind of like biblical or kind of religious cadence, right? That like the way that those texts are shaped, like, the Bible is not in the business of selling itself, right? That is a job of people who hold the Bible and then go and try to sell it. But the text itself is like, it's not like, oh, like how can I convince you? The text is, these are things that happened, and these are true. All religious texts are like that. They tell you marvelous, miraculous things, stories that you would never believe, and the way they tell them to you is that this is just true. There's no like hemming or hawing. They don't feel the need to convince you. They don't need to persuade you or show you why it happened. They just say it's true. And that's what magical realism is, right? You just have like totally fantastical things that happen in a story, and the story is unconcerned with explaining it to you. It doesn't even pretend to acknowledge that you might be unpersuaded or that you might be doubtful. It knows itself to be true, and that's how it proceeds. And I think, like, that's the angle that magical realism intervenes, is that it can bridge these two different ways of knowing and come out to this answer of like, we simply don't need to know. I can tell you what it is, and here's what it is.
So, in terms of genre, how are you categorizing this book?
in my mind, um, in the bookstore of my mind, it lives next to like Jose Saramago and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and like Jorge Luis Borges. Like it is in that zone of books that are fantastical that use magical realism but are also interested at base with like politics in the kind of very broad, like even like Aristotelian sense of like how should we live with one another? What do we owe to each other? Um, but I think in like a commercial bookshop that takes like normal dollars and trades goods for money, like I think it would probably go in just regular fiction. Um, like I think it would go in normal.
It's very special. What are you talking
I
about?
think it'd go in regular. Um, but I like I've seen people talk about it like science fiction, and I've seen people talk about it like it's fantasy, and I kind of feel bad because I think that like people who consider themselves readers of either of those genres would be surprised at what this book is. Because I don't think it's like The Martian, and I don't think it's like the Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings. I mean, I think they would like it. I think everyone would like my book, actually. Um, I remember that. Uh, but I think that they would be surprised. I think that putting a genre label on things also imposes a certain set of expectations that the reader has, right? Like if I picked up a book from the mystery section of the bookstore and it was like at the end it was like, and we'll never know. I'd be like, that sucks. Like what was this for? Right. But if I picked up that same book in the literary fiction section, I'd be like, oh, how interesting. Like the world is ambiguous. Very cool.
Yeah, yeah. It's all about placement, all about context. So kind of going back to, the spirituality and this what happens after we die, so much of this book is preoccupied with death and eternal life and mortality. And there are so many different characters that have very different relationships to death and mortality. Some of them are embracing it, some of them are, doing everything in their power to avoid death. What is it, do you think, like, what do these different characters have to teach us about mortality?
I mean, I love that question. I think the thing that's so great about everyone here is that like none of us have died, right? But we really we it's a really fun thing that we get to do where it's like we have this experience that we all know will happen to us that none of us can avoid that we know people that it's happened to, right? Like this would be like if we all had to get on a roller coaster at the end, but like no one ever got to tell us what it was like. Right, it's we have this event horizon in our lives that we all know about, that we all walk unceasingly toward, and the best we can do is just tell stories to each other about what happens beyond that, right? And every single everything that we try to say about it, like ultimately comes up against the abyss of, well, you haven't died, right? And no one who's died has been able to be like, all right, like here's what it's like. And I think like into that unknowing, like it's the ultimate horizon. Um, and I mean the joke is of course to say like when someone's like, oh, I'm dying, and you go like, well, so is everybody, right? But like mortality is something that we all know and we learn about and we know it's permanent and we know there's no coming back from it, and yet we hope, right? And like I think that's like that to me is the most human thing that we can do when we're faced with something like that. Like we have a certainty that we cannot evade, and yet we still hope. And I think that approach I find so astonishing. I think it's so moving that stories are enough, right? That if you believe enough in some stories, like you will no longer be afraid of death. That you will go gladly, and you'll think that it's a great thing for everyone, and that it's noble and good. And I think it's spooky also. I'm fascinated by the power of stories to reach beyond event horizons and come back with something in their hands, even if there's no verifying it, but something. And when we look at that something, that we can all kind of stand around it and say like, yeah, that seems right. Um, and like the characters in this book are obsessed with death, like because I and myself am obsessed with death, right? I think that like if anyone has any obsessions, like the first of them should be death, right? It is the thing that we don't know anything about, and that's what's cool about it. and that's what makes it like rich and deserving of thinking and a good target for stories.
Yeah, okay. So there is an adage, digging a hole to China, that reappears in this story. Kind of becomes this refrain used by different characters. And there are these holes, these tunnels, there are doors that appear and disappear. There are these portals to different times and places throughout this book. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, what do these portals say to us about, these characters' access to other worlds, maybe worlds that they've lost or left behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this memory that I it was really kind of been formative in my life where I was in this astronomy class and they had us all it was a horrendous class. It was a 9 a.m. I just want this to be like I just want everyone to know that this is bad. It was a 9 a.m. lecture and an 11 p.m. lab at the observatory. And so it was a thing that you had to drink coffee twice for. Um but at the lab, right, you go there and you're bleary eyed and it's 11 p.m. and you would rather be anywhere else. And they had us look at this telescope and we all take turns. And the telescope is kind of unwieldy, and we can't really get a good look at it. But when we do, we see Jupiter, and we can see these dots. They're the moons of Jupiter, and they're in a line because they all orbit the same plane. We all orbit the same plane. We're all on the same plane going around the sun. And when I looked at Jupiter and I saw its moons, they were not horizontal. They were at an angle. And at that moment to realize, right, that well, my whole I'm at an angle on Earth. I'm askew, right? I'm on the skin of a planet, and I'm not straight up and down. I'm not aligned with the world because there is an alignment of the world, and we're out of it. Like that, I found totally arresting. Um, and to go from that and to think of I don't know, just the way that we can pass into other worlds by wanting to be there hard enough, right? Or like the way that we get around, or like to know that this world is just this big and you can get all the way around it, and that we have ways of putting ourselves around the planet, right? Like I flew to China lots of times as a kid, and I remember thinking that's the longest flight anyone's ever got to do in their entire lives. And that actually is true still. Um, but then learn that a nuclear missile does that in half an hour, right? Or that if there were a hole to China, you would fall through the Earth in 2 hours. It's there's ways of compressing distance in the mind that make actual living in distance and space, like walking around with 2 feet in this world, like feel more potent. And I think the power of the door is not necessarily that you can go through it. The power of the door is that it exists, right? I think I've always been really struck by I don't like sometimes you walk by buildings, right, and you see like on like 3 floors up is just a door. Have you seen this? Right? And you're like if that door opened, like you would just fall right out of the building. Right? Like it and we actually were like, you should never open that door. That's a horrible door to open. But it's powerful because it's there. There is the door calls to us because it is possibility. Not because we can get to it, but because someone can. Right? Like the hole to China is like we don't want to dig the hole, but like you someone could do it. Right? Like a door to another world we might never be able to open, but that there's a door there means it's not impossible. Um, and and then to imagine what if like what is it like to be the person that gets to go through that door and come back?
Huh. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what the whole book is like. You got to understand. I mean, if you're enjoying these answers, you should totally read the book. Highly recommend. Another recurring symbol in this book is the color white. We have the white dog, the chrysanthemums turn white at one point, and there's also the white buck. And I was curious, is there a particular reason why you chose this color? What does it mean for this story?
Yeah. I I mean obviously it has a racial kind of connotation to it. but it's also like whiteness is also it's the funerary color in Chinese culture. It is it's the color of mourning, right? It's like it's death. I remember as a kid I would wear white t-shirts and my grandma would like have me go change like for fear that the color of my t-shirt would result in me being scythed away on my way to school like by a school bus, like. But she was very superstitious about these things, and to have that association with white, I think the chrysanthemums turn white, like they become by that transformation like a flower that attests to mourning and that is concerned with loss. um but I think the other thing about white is that it's like like it doesn't exist. Like there is no color white. Like the color white is just all colors. um I remember once I looked, I was like, why are so many, like why are most chemicals just white powders? And the answer is like they're not, right. They're white powders to us because like the spectrum in which they like reflect light is just not visible to us, and so they seem to reflect all light. But like everything is a color in some part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, we just can't see it, right. And so in that case white becomes like not an absence of color but just like an absence of us. It's a failure of our perception rather than a failure on the part of the thing being perceived. And I mean, I just love that. Right? Like there are like bees can see UV, right? And they can move around the world and they can see flowers, and all of the white flowers to us are beautiful to them,
Mm.
right? But they're white to us, and I don't know. I think it's a color which is not a color, which also like has so many things stapled to it that it's become heavy and burdensome just to like kind of move around under its own weight, and then you just take that color and you're like, what if things just started becoming white?
Mm.
Like just got blanched. Yeah, this is kind of it's kind of an unsatisfying answer because I guess ultimately I'm just working my way to like I think it's cool. Right? Like I think it's cool and interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean it is cool. There's a lot in this book that is very cool. So we're going to be winding down a little bit, heading towards audience Q&A. But my final question for you is, what are you working on now in terms of writing? If we are, can we be allowed to know?
Yeah, of course. And here's what I have. And I'm not like being coy. This is genuinely all I have. Um Ocean, deep like ocean, deep sea fishing, um transgenic lab mice, like lab mice that we've engineered to get human diseases, taxidermy, um, and ocean again. Yeah, but again, like I'm not like I like I promise I'm not being cute, right? Like that. This is genuinely all, and you can see why it's a nightmare to be my editor. But that's all I have.
I mean, that's a rock and foam so far. I mean, I can't wait to see what that turns into. Alrighty, alrighty. I think it is high time for audience questions. I'm going to be repeating questions for the folks who are joining us through Zoom. Yeah, we have some Zoom questions already.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think that like writing is at heart an incredibly antisocial, very unpleasant, horrible activity. Like it is. I once described it to someone as like psychosis that you get to like hopefully earn money from, right? Like because you can in any other situation, like if you met someone at a party and they told you about people that don't exist in a place that they like that isn't here, right? And they tell you that it's ruining their life and it's all they can think about, you'd be like, oh wow, like I like like I think I'm gonna go freshen up my drink, like but like you try to get away from that conversation, but like the thing that makes a writer different from someone who is or the thing that makes a writer like in addition to being a writer in addition to just like having these delusions is that they put it down, right, and they write it down. And I think like it for me staying in this world is a that's the only way that I can write, right? Like I can't really get lost in the text because I have to make the text. And it's so grueling for me that being in my body is a huge part of my writerly practice. That's the reason I do field work, right? As I like to go to places, and like if it's hot there, as it is in DC right now, like if it's hot, like I want to feel that. I want to know what it's like to be a body in that temperature and to kind of cope with that. I think that embodied text is like the whole point of writing stories that feel like something to someone else. And I mean, I don't recommend writing the way that I write either. I think that I write in a very kind of horrible way. Like I do like 14-hour days, like like for 3 months in a row, and it hollows me out. Um, so I don't recommend that anyone write that way. But I think that like being embodied is a big part of what allows me to write.
Mm, mm. Yeah, in the back there. All right. So the question is, can you talk about your trips to South Dakota?
Yeah. So I was there a couple times. Obviously, like if you drive the 90 across the country, you'll pass through South Dakota. I love the way that the landscape gives you it does a narrative, right? If you're driving west to east, like you come in from the Black Hills, like you've just seen the splendor of the American West, and then in South Dakota, you watch that quiet down.
Mm,
Like the hills get smoother, the trees go away, and then like you can watch everything relax and kind of unfurl into what is going to be the 14-hour slog across the Midwest. And I say slog lovingly. I live in Iowa right now. But like South Dakota feels like this kind of liminal space, right, between between the drama of the the Rockies and a high country and just like corn country. Um, and because it's a liminal space, I'm very pleased to report I'm not the only person who's felt the kind of fascination with South Dakota. The other people that felt fascinations with South Dakota are the nuclear war planners who look at it and said like the population density here is low enough that we can put essentially targets for enemy countries in this land. And so like it's this place which is both a transition, but it's also it is where the end of the world will happen, right? Or at least I mean now they decommissioned the silos, but for many decades it was like if the end of the world happens, the first people who will know that it's on its way are the people who have the land on like that the silos are sitting on,
mm,
and they'll just be like I don't know like putting out nitrogen or something, and they'll watch this missile rip out of the ground, and when that goes, they'll know that they have about 15 minutes before one comes back in from the sky, and like that's a crazy place, right? And I went to South Dakota and I saw these old silos and I saw these old houses and I talked to the farmers and I was like, and I had this book of questions. I had like a whole notebook that I had so many questions for them, and I was like, what is it like to live next to a megaton warhead, right? Like, what is it like knowing that your house is within the blast radius of the end of the world? And they were like, oh well, like when we mow the grass, we have to make sure to start the turn early so that we can get around the silo in time. And I was like, that's it? Right? And what I realized was I went there to learn about what it was like to be next to such things of power. And I came away realizing like that we can get used to anything. And that at the same time, like none of us are farther away from those silos than they are. The end of the world will come for us all, right? And because of that we've all gotten used to it. It's no different living right next to a silo than it is living in a major city. Like it is simply like that's what the end of the world is definitionally. Is it's everybody. And I really learned that in South Dakota.
right. Any other questions from our live audience? Well, you're live too over Zoom. I'm sorry. Yes, in the back.
Fearful Christianity and banned white T-shirts and such. And obviously, the book is very filled with spirituality and religion and magic and magical realism, from what I can tell. I'm curious. You've also spoken so much about loving science and always like seeking answers for everything. I'm just curious if you consider yourself a religious or spiritual or even superstitious person and how that affects your writing about this.
Mm. So the question is, do you consider yourself a superstitious or spiritual person, and how does that impact your writing?
Yeah. Like well, Reverend. No, no, I think as a child, I think I would have said I was religious, like probably out of fear or just knowing that like even if I wasn't religious, it was the thing that I at least did it once a week, which is more than I like practice piano, and like I would have said as a kid, oh, I play the piano. So like I think I'd like by that same logic I would have said I was religious. But like do I consider myself a spiritual person? That's a really fun question. I think what I would say is that I am someone who I think I'm receptive to being astonished. I like I don't I'm not really interested in like a kind of coherent understanding of benevolence or something, but like I consider myself to be I love to be amazed by things. And I think like I find that both in reading about science as I do about like interacting with like talking to people who are spiritual, right? But like I think I get the same amount of joy out of like finding out. I just spent a lot of time. I was very interested in like the blue LED is incredibly difficult to make. Um, I went to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and I was like, how cool is it that I'm like I like that these the people who made this like they're the same species that I am. Like that like I could never do this, but it's cool that someone did, right? And they also had 10 fingers and 10 toes, right? And like and they walked around just like me. Like I think I if I'm spiritual, it's a spirituality of amazement. Like I love being here. I love looking at stuff and learning about stuff and talking to people and like and that's my spirituality, right? Is like it's just amazing to be around.
Right. Yeah.
Your your books that you've
Yeah.
written so far are about West, and you're not from the West. So what has drawn you to this kind of landscape, place, mythology?
So the question is, what is it about the American West? What draws you to that landscape and that place?
Yeah, I have a very simple answer for you, which is that I grew up in cities, right? So I moved to Sydney when I was 2, and then I moved to New York when I was 4. And for most of my childhood, we didn't really go anywhere. I did summer school. I pretended to play the piano. Um, but I didn't really get to see the West until I was in college. I kind of finagled my way into having a driver's license, which I don't think I should have had. Um, by the end of high school in New York. And so when I got to California, which I went for undergrad, I bought a used car and I think like most people get cars when they're teenagers, and so like it's freeing, but also they have to come home to their parents every night. But when you get a car for the first time in college, like there are no rules. You can do anything, right? It's just like if you were willing to pay for gas and sleep in your car, you can get as far as you want. Um, and so the simple answer is like, why do I love the West? Like that is where I first saw the stars. I couldn't see them in New York. I'd read about them in books. I'd seen the constellations, right? And I was like, there's something called the Big Dipper, which like you can only see if you like really know what you're talking about. And then I was out in the desert, and I was like 19, and I looked up and I saw the stars, and I was like, this is the place. This is where it's at. Like it's very cool that we built skyscrapers and that like the subway runs 24/7 in New York, but this is where the rest of it lives.
Right. Very good. Yeah. I have the question over here.
Sit down and open the book, the location, what they're drinking, what they're listening to. What is that setting?
All right. So the question is, if you could pick the perfect setting for somebody to open up and read this book, the location, what they're drinking, what they're eating, can you describe that setting for us?
That's a great question. That's a pro question. That's a that's a plant question. That's amazing. That's a great question. I would I my answer is like I would want you to be in the place that the book is at. I would like you to be in South Dakota, but like minus the like the mosquitoes and it wouldn't be so hot, right? It would be like it would be like a sunset that just keeps going, right? So like you have enough light to read, but you don't feel like that you have to get out of the porch soon because like it's getting dark. I think the coolest thing that a book can do is take you outside of time. And so, to the time portion of that question, I'd say like no time, right? You like an eternal late afternoon where the weather's just perfect and you're on a porch and the world is just it just keeps going on and on and on in South Dakota. Just to clarify.
We probably have time for one more. Any brave soul? Yes. The question is, why Babylon?
That's a great question. The Air Force base in the book, which is named Babylon AFB, used to be called Clarendon, which I thought was like sufficiently military and kind of like boring and staid and buttoned up. Um, and then I was like, like why? Like the military in real life has to be boring and staid and buttoned up, but I don't have to write the real military. And so I was like I will give it a name that I think is befitting of a place where people are trained to kill, which is Babylon. Right. That ancient site of excess, which is doomed to fail. But I think the other thing about Babylon is like it's so evocative and it stands in for so many things. But the thing for me that it stands in for the most is empire. Like a conglomeration of power and wealth and ability, which are crucially like no one ever no one ever writes about Babylon like from the perspective of a Babylonian, right? It's never like POV, you're a Babylonian citizen, and it's like wow, like this is great, like nothing bad will ever happen in this city, right? Like Babylon is always something that you look upon, right? Or that you look like that you are beneath and you look up to. Like it is a machine which is going and going and is so powerful and unstoppable, and you're not in it and you're not at the controls and you're not there and that's all you have of it is I think that's experience also of empire and that's experience I think as far as I can tell of interacting with the United States military as well is like you witness an enormous armature of power and violence. It comes down and kind of scythes away a stretch of something and then disappears, right? And I love it. I love the way it sounds. Babylon. I think it's a great acoustic thing. I think it sounds better than Clarendon, which I think was a real miss on my part.
Well, thank you. That was incredible.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Really, thank you, Stevie and Tom. What a fantastic conversation. The only part about hosting events that I don't like is having to come up here and cut the conversation short. So that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you both again for being here. Thank you all. We will now take just a minute to reset our space and regroup. I'm going to take Tom and Stevie back to our makeshift green room before bringing Tom back out where he will sign books for you. He's generous enough to do that. And I'll ask if while we're waiting for the reset, if you all would help us fold up your chairs and put them against the wall. We'll help you too. We won't leave you to it all alone. And if you still need a copy of the book, upstairs. So thank you all so much. We'll see you back in just a minute.